But I do want to ask, how did the Trinity come to be theologically? And how did the Bible become canon? I heard that there were 30 Gospels, 26 of which were thrown away and 4 were kept: Mark, Matthew, Luke, and John.
It's a really interesting question that requires substantive study of Christian history. It's interesting, most people don't know this, but the Christian canon was not definitively and officially closed till the 16th century, the Council of Trent. This is 1,000 years after Islam. The first Christian bishop who suggested that these present 27 books should be the only books to be read was Athanasius of Alexandria, who was actually the bishop of Arius. So Arius and Athanasius were both at Nicaea, and Athanasius won through vote. But his letter in 367 of the Common Era, it's called the 39th Festal Letter, he was the first one who said, just read these 27 books from Matthew to Revelation, our present canon. But that's just one man's opinion, basically. And, Bart Ehrman did his dissertation on Didymus the Blind, who was another scholar in Alexandria, a contemporary of Athanasius, living in the same time in the same city. And Didymus the Blind's canon was different than Athanasius. People think that Athanasius settled the canon. No, he didn't do that at all. There was massive difference of opinion into the 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, 8th century as to what books should be included definitively and what books should be excluded. I mean, there was a synod at Hippo in 393, right? But this was a minor council. It's not an ecumenical council. So everyone at this time was basically Catholic. The Proto-Orthodox had become Catholic. A minor council is not binding upon the Christian world, only an ecumenical council. And that didn't happen until the 16th century. And contrary to popular belief, the Council of Nicaea had nothing to do with the canon and New Testament canon. It did not deal with the canon. I think this rumor comes from Dan Brown or something, the Da Vinci Code or something like that. There are Christian apologists who will insist that the canon was settled in the 2nd century. And this is just completely inaccurate. I mean, you had early church fathers quoting from, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, but they also quoted from other things as well. I mean, Serapion, one of the church fathers of the time, he actually believed the Gospel of Peter was authentic and endorsed it, but then later on said, no, actually, it's heresy. Didymus the Blind, as I said earlier, he didn't accept 2 Peter. He thought it was a total forgery. He included in his canon the Shepherd of Hermas, the Epistle of Barnabas, which are very, very interesting books. I mean, the Epistle of Barnabas, you talk about antinomianism. And the Epistle of Barnabas is also in the Codex Sinaiticus, which is the oldest complete New Testament in existence. It's dated to like 350 of the Common Era. And its canon includes the Epistle of Barnabas. And this person, Barnabas, who wrote this, and it's not the Gospel of Barnabas. Muslims get these things confused. Completely different. The Epistle of Barnabas, actually, the author says that the Jews completely misunderstood all of the dietary restrictions in the Torah, and that when God said, don't eat pig, he means to say, don't hang out with people who are pigs. That's what it means. You've always been allowed to eat pigs. And then when he said, don't be like the hyena, it's because the hyena can switch its gender. So don't be like a man one day and a woman like another. Don't be gender fluid. This is what he says, the author of the Epistle of Barnabas. And then he says something really interesting about the weasel. I won't talk about what he says about the weasel. But he accepted that. I mean, whoever wrote the Codex Sinaiticus, probably a committee, maybe Eusebius of Caesarea, because Constantine commissioned some Bibles. This could have been maybe one of them. So it seems like this was part of the Christian canon. So if you read the Gospel of Luke, Luke has a preamble, and people should read that preamble. People kind of they read it quickly and get to the sort of meat of the issue, the heart of the story, as it were. But Luke actually says that it seemed like a good idea for him to write a gospel because polloi, the Greek polloi, means many have undertaken this. There were many gospels. That's what he says at his time. Luke is writing, according to most historians, confessional and non-confessional. He's probably writing around 80, 85, something like that, maybe 90. And by that time, there are many gospels written about Jesus. Now, what are these gospels? What is he talking about? From a Christian confessional perspective, he could only be talking about basically Mark and Matthew, and that's about it, right? But that's not many, because Luke says he says himself in Luke chapter 6 that when Jesus came to Peter and he said, cast your net, he says there was so many fish in the net that the nets were going to break. And the word he uses there is polloi. There was polloi fish. That means there were hundreds of fish in this net. So polloi gospels does not mean 2 gospels. Yeah. It means possibly dozens of gospels. Where are these gospels? These are lost to history. We don't know where they are. Every so often some Bedouin or, he's in a cave somewhere in Egypt or in Jordan or something like that. I mean, that's how the Dead Sea Scrolls was discovered. The Nag Hammadi Library. The Nag Hammadi Library contains, these are 4th century documents, but scholars believe that they're copies of 1st and 2nd century Christian gospels. The Gospel of Thomas. Many scholars date that to the 1st century. or right around the time John wrote his gospel. It's a contemporary with the Gospel of John. And the other thing is, how did they actually pick the canon? How did the early church fathers, how did they determine the canon? Well, basically, if something was orthodox according to them, if it was in agreement with their theology, then they would attribute it to an apostle, right? Even if the book is anonymous. For example, the Gospel of Matthew is anonymous. Whoever wrote Matthew did not identify himself. But the early church fathers, they liked this gospel. So they said, okay, fine, Matthew wrote it. Matthew is a disciple. But then you look at something like the Gospel of Thomas, which is written around the same time, according to many scholars, late first century.
Yeah.
And the author identifies himself explicitly as Thomas, a disciple, as an apostle. Because it didn't jive with the proto-orthodoxy of the church fathers, they said, this must be a forgery.
Wow. So they decided what was true about Jesus and then used that as a criteria to confirm or deny anything that was written about Jesus. That's very interesting.
Yeah,
So
like the gospel. I'll give you another example. The Gospel of Peter, according to many scholars, late first century, maybe early second century. I mean, right around the time Acts was written, maybe the Gospel of John was written. The Gospel of John, again, is anonymous. The Gospel of Peter explicitly claims itself to be authored by Peter, but was considered to be, like I said, Serapion accepted at one point, then he went back. Because the crucifixion scene is strange. It says that when they crucified Jesus, he was silent, as if he felt no pain. And they said, well, what's going on here? What happened? Was Jesus' soul maybe raptured up into heaven? Are they crucifying sort of an empty shell of a body? So they didn't like that, because Jesus has to suffer for our sins, right? His pain is our gain, as it were. Eventually, that gospel, which explicitly is authored, whoever wrote this gospel said, I'm Peter, that's rejected. But the Gospel of Mark, which is anonymous, is accepted. And Mark is a student of Peter, according to the proto-Orthodox.
that's very, very interesting. To be fair to Mark and Matthew, they were written fairly early, maybe compared to some of the other ones. I think maybe the comparison is so minimal that, for example, like what you mentioned, the Gospel of Thomas, the Jesus Seminar, they compiled the book called the Five Gospels, and they included the Gospel of Thomas, and they were voting on every verse that Jesus allegedly said. They were voting on the probability of him actually saying that. So they included that. And as a historical document, that might actually lead to some of the things Jesus did say, historically speaking. So I think that that is very interesting.